Ladies and gentlemen, welcome please. Joe Moore in the reading of Isn't It Beautiful by Russ Curtis and Joe Moore in his book In Full Disclosure. Enjoy.
Isn't It Beautiful from In Full Disclosure by Russ Curtis and Joe Moore. Mrs. Pope loved Halloween. She lined the sidewalk with pumpkins she harvested out of her own garden. Cloth ghosts were suspended from her front porch. The handrails of her steps were coated with spun fabric to look like spiderwebs, and she always answered the door with a playful but surprisingly quick boo. Unlike other parents who obligingly answer the door with a cigarette hanging from their lips, quickly dumping candy into our sacks without making eye contact so that they could go back to their six-packs and sitcoms, Mrs. Pope carefully inspected each goblin and ghoul. She would come out onto her stoop and say things like, "Oh my, what do we have here? Let's see. We got a fairy princess and a hobo, Wonder Woman, and over here is a pirate that looks suspiciously like Billy McLean." Down the line she'd go, with each interpretation and commentary. Now was our turn at Mrs. Pope's house, and I was excited to be where I could finally get the recognition that I deserved. After all, I put a lot of work into this and desperately needed validation. I nervously waddled up to her doorstep, making sure to be first in line. Isn't it beautiful? Yes, sort of. Mrs. Pope proceeded to confidently name all my friends. Spider-Man, there were two in my group, Wonder Woman, and Hobo, but her face froze when she got to me. She'd blown it, and she knew it. She should have scanned the entire group first and made sure that she could name everyone, but in her excitement she rattled everyone off before realizing she had no idea what I was. In retrospect, she should have been terrified. She knew my self-esteem rested in her hands that Halloween evening. So what did she do? She reverted back to childhood antics and gave what's known as the slow reply. You all remember the slow reply. That's when you've done something wrong, but you're not sure if your accuser is 100% convinced it was you. Journey back with me for a few minutes. Take breaking a lamp for an instance. Your mom knows the lamp is broken, there's no question about that, but it could have been the cat, or a slight earthquake, or the football which is lying nearby. She's not completely sure, and she doesn't want to accuse you just yet, so she asks, "What happened to the lamp?" Now, this is a critical juncture. You could tell the truth, the fact that you threw the football despite repeated warnings not to do so and face the consequences, or you could do the slow reply. I don't know. All the while paying close attention to her facial expression. If during the slow reply her eyes stay wide as if thinking of another possibility, you're free. However, if her eyes narrow, you immediately refrain from finishing the slow reply and admit culpability. For one is not in nearly as much trouble when one tells the truth than when one lies about it and gets caught. This was the tactic used by Mrs. Pope. Though her face remained steady, I could sense that she was feverishly trying to categorize me. The children were agonizing along with her and waited impatiently for the verdict. When she finally offered the slow reply, "You are a Martian." If she'd read my facial expression, I was, after all, the only one without a mask or makeup. She would have stopped right there and given me candy. I would have been a happy camper, self-esteem intact. Now, let me stop here for a minute. I was not a Martian. But back then, it was not uncommon for Martians to be depicted as robots. Today, however, we know that Martians, more commonly referred to as aliens or extraterrestrials, are humanoid-like creatures with big heads and eyes and fewer fingers. But I wasn't going to fault Mrs. Pope for calling me a Martian. Honest mistake. Give me the candy, no hard feelings. But she didn't stop there. See, she was not as astute as many of you counselors are in reading nonverbals. She continued, hoping, I guess, to be as inclusive as possible. So unlike many of you who, when answering case study questions, give the scattershot answer, betting you'll receive partial credit, it was what you as counselors know that Mrs. Pope didn't that shattered my self-esteem, which has never been regained, I should add. Mrs. Pope said, "You are a Martian football player." She said the football part real quick, hoping I heard it if I was and hoping I didn't if I wasn't. We all know the routine. We've all done the, "Hey, jump hole Ringo Richard," when we weren't sure of someone's name, but didn't want to hurt his feelings. That was it, though. That's all it took to not only ruin Halloween, but to also destroy my confidence and initiate my disturbance. I wanted to scream, "I'm neither a Martian nor a football player." But at that point, I just wanted the fool to give me my candy so I could go. She did, and I left. And I may have a few more stops that night, but it's not at all clear to me now. The one thing I do know for sure was that Halloween ended with Mrs. Pope's life-shattering faux pas. Isn't it beautiful? I know you. Yes.